Russia has a very strange type of the political regime. On the surface, when we look at the facade, we have all democratic institutions. But in reality, this facade, this makeup, conceals authoritarian, oligarchic, and bureaucratic trends. And of course, this impression is deceitful. But behind this liberal mantra of Russian political leaders, and especially President Medvedev, we could see how the repressive regime is evolving with elements of the police state. You know, like with all hybrid regimes, Russia is moving in both directions simultaneously. On the one hand, there is liberal rhetoric and even cooptation of liberals into the official structures. On the other hand, Russian political leaders expand the functions of the law enforcement organs and FSB, this is a successor to KGB, and using repression in many cases, for instance, to quash to the rallies in defense of the Constitution. Well, and in fact, the situation is becoming much worse in the situation when Russia resets its relationship with the West, which could also create a wrong impression. Well, any reform is possible only when society is ready. And it seems to me that more than 30% of Russians would love and is ready to live in the system that we call liberal democracy. About 30% Russians could be persuaded to move in this direction. So there are no insurmountable obstacles for the Russian movement towards reform, transformation, and liberal democracy. This is the elite stupid. This is the political elite that is not ready, is not able, has no drive, has no stamina, and in fact would like this personified power to preserve its position and its corporate vested interests. We need only one thing to get rid of the system based on the monopoly hold on power and introduce political pluralism, political competition, and political struggle. And in order to make it possible, of course, there should be pressure from below. But at the same time, there should be understanding within the political milieu, intellectual circles, that otherwise, you know, this is the suicidal statecraft. And Russia will be moving towards a disaster. When these two factors come together, it's still very early to say. But Russia already is very much unsatisfied with its current situation. Well, in fact, a reset has been welcomed in the Russian society. If 2 years ago only 47% viewed the United States in a positive, benevolent way, now more than 60% view the United States in such a positive way. But at the same time, when we look at the Russian liberals, they're pretty unsatisfied with the reset because they view reset as temporary normalization of the relationship, which does not deal with deep normative, roots of the mistrust. And even the Russian political leadership, for instance, Medvedev and Putin, are unsatisfied with reset because they are expecting from the United States more concessions. So everything says that apparently reset without continuation, without more trust, without more engagement, could not be a sustainable phenomenon. Well, there are a lot of people who believe that reset simply tactical adjustment of each other, that this is the policy that meets tactical interests of both sides. And in fact, even this reset is quite a positive phenomenon. But we shouldn't exaggerate the meaning of reset as the policy that could bring, benevolent engagement and will solve all problems. And besides, reset is based on 3 pillars that are pretty vulnerable because, well, it's based on the pillar of common interests, and we have interests common only to some, up to the point. And it's based on the principle of delinking foreign policy from domestic development. And if we delink foreign policy from domestic development, we can't understand what's going within the country and, domestic repercussions. And besides, we cannot have dual-track engagement with the Russian civil society under the control of the Kremlin. The West, of course, can pursue, with respect to Russia, its own tactical interests or strategic interests. I cannot speak on behalf of the United States, but what Russian society and Russian liberals, liberal Russia, would expect from the West, I would say we expect common strategy towards Russia that would be based not only on tactical maneuvering and situational agenda, but on long-term interests in Russia and long-term engagement. We would welcome the mechanism of conditionality, which would tie the way a Russian political and economic elite do its business in the Western countries, including the United States, to the way the Russian elite behaves at home. And thirdly, we would really welcome and appreciate the Western assistance with transformation of new independent states. That could produce a good example for Russia. The current Western policy towards Russia is based on the principles of status quo. The West in general is oriented towards the status quo. The West has opted for the status quo. And the Western society apparently is tired of these, grand designs, breakthroughs, etc. And so it creates benevolent environment for the Russian status quo, for the preservation of the Russian system. So that for the time being, Western diplomacy and Western policy does not create incentives for liberalization in Russia. And that's very regrettable. There are several principles, and if the West follows these principles, it could create at least environment conducive for future Russian transformation. The first principle is practice what you preach. If the West again starts for the Russian population the role model, it would be great. If the West successfully copes with its own domestic problems, it would help us. Secondly, do no harm. If the Western politicians and the Western elite think twice about the repercussions of what they're doing vis-a-vis with respect to Russia, it will also help. And thirdly, we would welcome any kind of engagement on the level of society. It seems to me the West today should not be complacent, watching modernization mantra in Russia and believing what Medvedev and Putin are saying. Because this mantra is nothing only window ceiling, that in fact conceals degraded infrastructure, demoralized society, and growing divide between the authorities and the population. So the West should be prepared for very restless and very frustrated Russia that maybe in several years will be again at the fork, choosing its own direction and trajectory. So it seems to me in this case the West will have to think about the consequences of reset and look for another paradigm of engaging restless Russia that will be looking for a new future.